The Last Laugh. The town of Greystone had its secrets, but none were darker than the legend of the Midnight Clown. Every few years, a carnival would roll into town, bringing with it the usual games, rides, and fried food. But there was always one attraction that no one spoke of directly, an unlisted tent on the outskirts of the fairgrounds. The Midnight Show, starring Smiley the Clown. Smiley wasn't like the other performers. His face, painted with a permanent grin, was a disturbing contrast to his cold, emotionless eyes. His act, they said, wasn't for children. It was something far more sinister. Only those brave or foolish enough to enter his tent after midnight would ever learn the truth, and not all of them came back. It was a chilly October evening when Emily and her friends wandered through the fair, the air thick with the smell of popcorn and the sounds of laughter. The group had always been drawn to urban legends, and tonight they were determined to uncover the mystery of the Midnight Clown. "I'm telling you, it's just a story to scare people," Jason said, trying to sound confident as they passed the garishly lit booths. "Then why does no one go to the midnight show?" Emily shot back. "My grandma used to tell me about people who went in and were never the same after." Kyle, the skeptic of the group, scoffed. "It's all marketing. I bet it's just some cheesy haunted house thing." As midnight approached, the fair began to wind down, families leaving with tired children, and the lights of the rides dimming. But one tent, far from the main attractions, remained illuminated, a single bulb hanging above the entrance, casting eerie shadows on the red and white stripes. There was no sign, no announcement, just a flap that moved lazily in the breeze. "Are we really doing this?" Emily asked, her voice betraying her nerves. Kyle shrugged. "We came this far. Might as well see what all the fuss is about." Together, the three friends approached the tent. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, the dim lighting casting strange shadows on the worn canvas walls. The smell of grease paint and something sour lingered in the air. The seats were arranged in a semicircle around a small stage, but the space felt claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in. They sat down, unease growing with each passing second. Suddenly, the lights dimmed, and a spotlight clicked on, illuminating the stage. There was no music, no fanfare, just the sound of heavy breathing, like someone was watching from the darkness. From behind the curtain, Smiley the Clown emerged. He was taller than they expected, his colorful costume tight against his lanky frame. His face was a grotesque mask of white paint, with a red-painted grin that stretched unnaturally wide. But it was his eyes that unsettled Emily the most. Dark, bottomless pits that seemed to swallow the light. Smiley said nothing, only stared at the audience, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. The silence stretched on, growing more uncomfortable by the second. Then, without warning, he moved. With swift, jerking movements, Smiley began his act. It was no ordinary clown routine. He mimed actions that were disturbingly violent, cutting, stabbing, and tearing motions, accompanied by exaggerated facial expressions. All the while, his eyes never left the three friends. Emily felt her skin crawl. It wasn't funny. It wasn't even remotely entertaining. It was something far darker, as if Smiley were showing them something real, something personal. Halfway through the performance, Kyle leaned over to Jason. "I'm done with this. Let's go." But when they tried to stand, they couldn't. Their legs felt heavy, as though the chairs were holding them in place. Emily tried to move as well, but it was like an invisible force was pressing her down. Panic began to rise in her chest. Smiley's movements became faster, more frantic, as if feeding off their fear. His painted grin seemed to grow wider, stretching beyond the bounds of his face, and his eyes gleamed with a malicious delight. The tent grew colder, the air thick with the stench of decay. Emily's heart raced as she tried to scream, but no sound came out. Smiley's performance had changed. He wasn't miming anymore. From behind him, long, shadowy figures emerged, dressed like clowns but twisted and deformed. Their painted smiles were cracked, their limbs bent at wrong angles. They moved toward the friends, reaching out with long, bony fingers. Jason struggled, but his body remained frozen in place. Kyle's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. Emily's mind raced. This wasn't just a show. This was something far worse, something evil. Smiley approached them, his dark eyes locking onto Emily's. He leaned in close, the smell of rot heavy on his breath. "Welcome to the show," he whispered, his voice low and rasping. "You'll never leave." With that, the lights flickered, and the world around them began to warp. The tent seemed to stretch and distort, the walls rippling like waves. The twisted clowns closed in, their faces splitting into grotesque, unnatural smiles. Emily's vision blurred as the room spun. She could hear Jason and Kyle struggling, their muffled cries mixing with her own rising panic. The last thing she saw before everything went black was Smiley's face, that impossibly wide grin swallowing the light, leaving only darkness. The next morning, the fairgrounds were empty. The carnival had packed up and moved on, leaving behind only the faint impressions of tents and rides in the grass. There was no sign of the midnight show, no tent, no stage, nothing to suggest it had ever been there. Emily's parents were frantic, searching the town with the police for any sign of her and her friends. But there were no clues, no leads. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Years passed, and the town of Greystone moved on, but the legend of the Midnight Clown persisted. People whispered about the three friends who had disappeared one night, never to be seen again. Every few years the carnival would return, and with it, the midnight show. No one dared to enter after what had happened to Emily, Jason, and Kyle. But sometimes, late at night, if you stood near the fairgrounds, you could hear the faint sound of laughter. And if you listened closely, you could hear the voice of Smiley the Clown calling out from the darkness. "Welcome to the show. You'll never leave." Decades later, a group of teenagers from out of town, curious about the old legend, found themselves at the abandoned fairgrounds late one night. They laughed nervously, daring each other to look for the tent. One by one, they disappeared into the woods. The carnival would be back soon, and with it, Smiley's laughter. He was always looking for new members of his audience, the ones who would never leave.